Entire cities buried under 10 feet of mud, buildings with their first floors underground, doorways that open into basements, hundreds of photographs from the 1800s showing crews digging out windows that were supposed to be above ground. The mud flood theory claims that sometime in the 1800s a massive catastrophe buried cities across the world under layers of sediment. Proponents point to old buildings with basement windows at street level, buried archways, and historical photos showing excavation work in major cities. But here's the question. Nobody in the mud flood community seems to answer. If a flood of mud buried entire cities, where did all that mud actually come from? That's not a rhetorical question. It's a physics problem. And when you do the math, the whole theory collapses. Most people hear about the mud flood and immediately think about whether it happened. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, could it have happened? Because if you can't explain where thousands of cubic miles of mud materialize from, you don't have a theory. You have a fantasy. Let's talk about what it would actually take to bury a city. San Francisco covers about 47 square miles. If you wanted to bury it under 10 feet of mud, you'd need roughly 2.4 billion cubic feet of sediment. That's not an abstract number. That's actual dirt that has to come from somewhere, travel to the city, and settle uniformly across every street, every building, every hillside. Now scale that to every major city that supposedly got buried. New York, London, Paris, Moscow, Chicago, Boston. The mud flood theory claims this happened globally, all around the same time. We're talking about trillions of cubic feet of mud appearing out of nowhere and settling perfectly across the world. Here's where it gets interesting. Mud doesn't just appear. It comes from erosion, which is a slow process, or from catastrophic flooding, which requires a source. Let's look at both options. Erosion takes time. The Mississippi River, one of the largest river systems in North America, moves about 500 million tons of sediment per year. That sounds like a lot until you realize that's accumulated over its entire drainage basin, which covers 1.2 million square miles. And that sediment doesn't pile up in cities. It flows downstream and deposits in deltas and floodplains. To generate enough mud to bury even one major city would require either stripping topsoil from an area hundreds of times larger than the city itself, or some kind of event that pulverized and suspended vast amounts of earth all at once. Both scenarios have problems. If you strip topsoil from surrounding regions, you'd see evidence: massive erosion scars, entire landscapes scraped down to bedrock. Photos from the 1800s and early 1900s would show barren wastelands surrounding every major city. But we don't see that. We see forests, farmland, and natural terrain that looks consistent with normal geological processes. So maybe it was a flood, not slow erosion, but a sudden catastrophic event that picked up sediment and dumped it across cities. This is where proponents usually point to things like tsunamis or megafloods, but those don't work either, and here's why. Tsunamis are caused by underwater earthquakes or landslides. They move water, not mud. When a tsunami hits land, it brings seawater inland, maybe some coastal sediment, but it doesn't generate the kind of thick, uniform mud layers you'd need to bury buildings. Tsunamis are destructive because of their force and speed. They knock things down. They don't gently bury them under 10 feet of dirt. The 2011 Tohoku tsunami in Japan was one of the most powerful in recorded history. It devastated coastal cities, but it didn't bury them. It destroyed buildings, scattered debris, and left behind a thin layer of sand and silt in some areas. Nothing even close to the uniform city-wide burial that mudflood proponents describe. Then there's the issue of water source. A flood big enough to carry that much sediment would need an enormous body of water. Where did it come from? The oceans didn't rise and fall by hundreds of feet in the 1800s. We have tidal records, coastal measurements, and geological evidence that would show something that dramatic. We also have accounts from ships at sea during that period. No one reported the ocean disappearing or surging. Some mud flood proponents suggest underground water reservoirs or some kind of liquefaction event. But liquefaction happens during earthquakes when saturated soil temporarily loses strength and behaves like a liquid. It affects localized areas, not entire continents. And it doesn't create new mud, it just rearranges what's already there. Let's talk about what we actually see in those old photographs. Yes, there are images of streets being raised, buildings with basement level windows at ground level, and crews excavating around old structures. But every single one of those images has a documented explanation that doesn't require a global catastrophe. Cities raised their street levels intentionally. Chicago did it in the 1850s and 1860s to improve drainage and install sewer systems. Large sections of the city were physically lifted using jacks while new foundations were built underneath. Seattle did the same thing after a fire in 1889 destroyed much of downtown. The city rebuilt at a higher elevation to prevent flooding, which left old ground floors below the new street level. This wasn't unusual. It was standard urban planning in the 19th century. Cities built on low-lying ground or near rivers frequently dealt with flooding and poor drainage. Raising street levels was the solution. It's well documented, with city records, engineering reports, and contemporary newspaper accounts describing the process. When you see a photo of workers digging around an old building, you're often looking at infrastructure projects, installing water lines, sewer systems, gas lines, electrical conduits. Cities were being modernized, and that required excavation. The idea that every construction crew in every photo was uncovering a buried city is just not supported by the actual records from that time. Here's another problem with the mud flood narrative. Buildings don't survive burial the way proponents claim they do. If a structure gets buried under 10 feet of sediment, especially wet sediment, it experiences enormous pressure. Wooden buildings would collapse, brick and stone buildings would crack and shift. Foundations would fail. You wouldn't end up with perfectly preserved buildings just waiting to be dug out. You'd end up with rubble. We have real-world examples of what happens when mud buries structures. The 1985 Armero tragedy in Colombia, when a volcanic mudflow buried the town under several meters of debris, didn't leave intact buildings. It destroyed them. The structures that remained were heavily damaged, displaced, and partially collapsed. That's what mud does when it moves with enough force to travel and bury things. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that some kind of fine, water-saturated sediment could bury a city gently enough to leave buildings intact. Where did that sediment come from, and why don't we see the source? Think about it geologically. Sediment doesn't just appear, it erodes from somewhere. If enough dirt was stripped from one area to bury multiple cities, we'd see massive geological scars. River valleys carved down to bedrock, hillsides completely eroded, plains scraped flat, and we'd see that sediment's journey. Massive deposits between the source and the cities, layers of mud in places that don't make sense. We don't see any of that. The geological record shows normal gradual sedimentation patterns, river deltas where they should be, glacial deposits from the Ice Age in the regions where glaciers actually were, volcanic ash layers corresponding to known eruptions. Everything matches long-term geological processes, not a sudden global mud catastrophe in the 1800s. Then there's the issue of timing. Mud flood proponents claim this happened in the early to mid-1800s, sometimes as late as the 1850s or 1860s. That's a period with extensive written records, newspapers, government documents, personal diaries, and international communication. If a global catastrophe buried cities, we'd have thousands of first-hand accounts describing it. We'd have diplomatic correspondence between nations. We'd have scientific investigations and attempts to understand what happened. We have none of that. What we have are normal historical records describing normal urban development, infrastructure projects, fires, floods, and the gradual evolution of cities. There's no gap in the record, no mysterious event that everyone somehow forgot to write about. Some proponents argue that the records were suppressed or altered, but that raises more questions than it answers. Who suppressed them? How did they coordinate across dozens of countries with different governments, languages, and political systems? Why would they suppress evidence of a natural disaster? And how did they manage to alter not just official records, but also private letters, diaries, photographs, and the memories of millions of people? The scale of conspiracy required to pull that off is absurd. You'd need to control every newspaper, every government archive, every personal correspondence, and every photograph from that era, and you'd need to do it perfectly, leaving no trace of the cover-up. That's not how information works. Secrets leak, documents survive, people talk. Let's look at one specific claim that gets repeated a lot. The idea that Old World architecture shows evidence of a more advanced civilization that was buried and then partially excavated. Proponents point to ornate buildings, large public structures, and intricate stonework as proof that the 1800s society couldn't have built them. But we have the actual records of these buildings being constructed. Architectural plans, construction contracts, worker payrolls, material invoices. We have photos of buildings under construction. We have the names of the architects and the firms that built them. The Chicago World's Fair buildings from 1893, for example, are extensively documented from design through construction to demolition. There's no mystery there. The craftsmanship isn't evidence of a lost civilization. It's evidence that the 19th century had skilled architects, engineers, and labourers who took pride in their work. Just because modern construction often prioritizes cost and speed over ornamentation doesn't mean earlier generations couldn't or didn't build impressive structures. They absolutely did, and we know how they did it because they wrote it down. Here's what actually explains the things mudflood proponents point to. Cities evolve, streets get raised for drainage and infrastructure, basements get converted to ground floor spaces when street levels change, old buildings get renovated and their entrances get modified. None of that requires a catastrophe. It's just normal urban development over time. The photographs showing excavation aren't evidence of uncovering a buried city. They're evidence of construction, renovation, and infrastructure work. When you're installing a sewer system, you have to dig. When you're building a subway, you have to excavate. When you're adding a basement to an existing building, you have to go down. That's not uncovering a lost world. That's just construction. And yes, some buildings have features that seem odd today. Windows below street level, doorways that open into sunken areas. But those features made sense when the buildings were constructed. Maybe the street was lower then. Maybe the entrance was designed for a specific purpose. Maybe the building was modified later. Context matters, and when you look at the actual history of individual buildings, the explanations are straightforward. The mudflood theory also ignores basic hydrology. Mud doesn't flow uphill. It doesn't settle uniformly across varied terrain. If a massive mudflow hit a city built on hills like San Francisco, you'd see sediment piled up in valleys and low areas, with high ground relatively clear. You wouldn't see every building, regardless of elevation, buried under the same depth of mud. That's not how gravity works. Real mudflows follow topography. They flow downhill, accumulate in depressions, and leave higher areas exposed. The 2014 Oso mudslide in Washington state is a good example. The debris followed the terrain, burying the valley floor while leaving higher ground untouched. If a city-burying mudflow had happened, the pattern of burial would reflect the landscape, not some uniform blanket coverage. Let's do some more math. If we assume a 10-foot layer of mud across a city, we're talking about a flow that carried an enormous amount of suspended sediment. Water can only carry so much sediment before it stops being water and becomes a debris flow or mudslide. Debris flows are dense, viscous, and incredibly destructive. They don't gently bury things, they demolish them. The viscosity of a mudflow depends on the ratio of water to sediment. Too much water, and the sediment settles out quickly, not giving you a thick, uniform layer. Too little water, and you get a slow-moving, dense slurry that wouldn't spread across an entire city before solidifying. There's no middle ground where you get a fast-moving, city-covering flow that somehow leaves buildings intact. And then there's the aftermath. When mud dries, it shrinks and cracks. A 10-foot layer of mud drying out would create massive cracks, subsidence, and instability. Buildings sitting on top of or partially buried in that drying mud would shift and settle unevenly. Foundations would crack. Walls would collapse. We'd see evidence of that kind of structural damage in old buildings if they'd been through a mud burial and excavation. But we don't. What we see instead is normal wear and tear, damage from known events like fires and earthquakes, and the effects of aging materials. Nothing suggests buildings were buried under tons of wet sediment and then dug out. the economic history angle is interesting too. The 1800s were a period of massive urbanization and industrialization. Cities were growing rapidly. Railways were being built. Telegraph lines were going up. Factories were opening. Trade was expanding. All of that requires workers, materials, and infrastructure. There are detailed economic records from this period: trade logs, tax records, census data, employment figures. If a catastrophe buried cities, you'd see it in the economic data: massive disruption to trade, population loss, labor shortages, economic collapse. None of that shows up. What you see instead is consistent growth with occasional downturns due to known events like financial panics, wars, and epidemics. The data doesn't support a global catastrophe. It supports normal economic development. Some proponents suggest the mud flood was localized to certain regions or cities, not global. But that doesn't fix the core problem. Even a localized event would need a source for the mud, a mechanism for transport, and a reason why it's not documented in any contemporary records from that place. Shrinking the scale of the claim doesn't make it more plausible. It just makes it easier to ignore the lack of evidence. Here's the thing about extraordinary claims: they require extraordinary evidence. The mud flood theory is making an extraordinary claim. It's saying that a massive catastrophic event buried cities across the world in the 1800s, and that this event was either forgotten or covered up. That's a huge claim. And the evidence for it is a handful of photographs that can be explained by routine urban development and a misunderstanding of how cities evolved. That's not extraordinary evidence. That's not even ordinary evidence. It's a misinterpretation of normal historical processes. The burden of proof is on the people making the claim. If you're going to say that cities were buried by mud, you need to explain where the mud came from. You need to show the geological source. You need to demonstrate the mechanism of transport. You need to provide contemporary accounts documenting the event. You need to explain why the evidence looks exactly like normal urban development and not like a catastrophe. None of that exists. And in the absence of that evidence, the rational conclusion is that the mud flood didn't happen. Not because we're close-minded, but because the claim doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Cities change over time. Streets get raised, basements get added, buildings get renovated, infrastructure gets installed. These are well-documented processes that happen gradually over decades. They don't require a catastrophe to explain. They require basic knowledge of urban history and civil engineering. The real history is actually more interesting than the mud flood myth. Cities in the 1800s were engineering marvels. They tackled massive challenges like drainage, sanitation, and transportation with innovative solutions. They raised entire city blocks, dug tunnels for subways, and installed networks of pipes and cables underground. That's not boring. That's impressive. And it's all documented. We have the plans, the budgets, the contracts, the photos, the newspaper articles, and the personal accounts of the people who did the work. The history is there if you're willing to look at it honestly. The mud flood theory persists because it offers a simple explanation for things that seem unusual at first glance. Why is that window below street level? Mud flood. Why are those workers digging around that building, uncovering a buried city? It's an easy answer that doesn't require understanding urban development, geology, or engineering. But easy answers aren't always right answers. Sometimes things seem unusual because we don't have the context. Once you learn the context, the mystery disappears. That basement window is below street level because the city raised the street to improve drainage in 1867. Those workers are digging because they're installing a sewer line. The building looks old and ornate because it was built in 1885 by skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. None of that is mysterious. It's just history. The question isn't whether we're being lied to or whether there's a conspiracy to hide the truth. The question is whether we're willing to do the work to understand what actually happened. Because the real history is available, the records exist, the explanations are there, you just have to be willing to read them. So where did all the mud come from? It didn't, because there was no mud flood. What we're seeing in old photos and old buildings is the normal evolution of cities documented in real time by the people who lived through it. That's not a cover-up, that's just history. Let's dig deeper into the photographic evidence because this is where mud flood proponents spend most of their time. They share images of construction sites, street work and excavation projects from the late 1800s and early 1900s. The argument is that these images show cities being uncovered from burial. But when you examine the photos in context, they tell a completely different story. Take the famous photographs of Chicago's street raising project. Between 1855 and 1865, the city systematically raised street levels across downtown to address severe flooding and drainage problems. Engineers like Ellis Chesbrough designed a comprehensive sewer system that required elevating streets by 4 to 14 feet in some areas. The project was documented extensively. Newspaper articles described the work. Engineering journals published technical details. Property owners filed complaints about the costs and disruption. We have photographs of the actual process, buildings being jacked up, new foundations being constructed, streets being filled in with sand and debris. Some building owners chose not to raise their structures, which is why you see old storefronts with their original entrances now below street level. That's not evidence of burial and excavation, that's evidence of a documented urban engineering project that people chose not to participate in fully. The same pattern repeats in other cities. Seattle raised its streets after the 1889 fire. The original street level became the Seattle Underground. That's documented history with architectural plans and city ordinances. Now let's talk about soil mechanics and what actually happens when water-saturated sediment moves. Mudflows are categorized by their solid content. A flow with 40 to 60% solids is considered a debris flow. Higher concentrations create something closer to a landslide. Lower concentrations are just dirty water that deposits very little sediment. For a mudflow to bury a city under 10 feet of material, you'd need an incredibly specific set of conditions. The flow would need enough water to travel long distances, but enough sediment to leave behind substantial deposits. It would need to move fast enough to cover large areas, but slow enough not to destroy everything in its path. And it would need to settle uniformly across varied terrain, which violates basic physics. Real-world mudflows don't behave that way. They follow topography aggressively. They pile up behind obstacles. They carve channels as they move. They leave behind chaotic deposits with mixed particle sizes, not uniform layers. The 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens created massive debris flows that traveled down river valleys. Those flows left deposits that are meters thick in some places and completely absent in others. The pattern reflects the flow's path and energy, not some uniform blanket coverage. If cities had been buried by mudflows, the geological evidence would be unmistakable. You'd find thick sediment layers that don't match local geology. You'd see deposits interrupting the normal soil profile. Geologists study this routinely. Sediment layers tell stories about where material came from, how it travelled, and why it settled where it did. The sediment layers under cities tell stories of gradual accumulation over thousands of years, punctuated by known events like floods, construction, and landfilling. They don't show sudden catastrophic deposits from the 1800s. The stratigraphy matches expectations based on local geology and known history. There are no mystery layers. Let's examine the economic implications more carefully. The 1800s saw unprecedented urban growth. London's population went from about 1 million in 1800 to over 6 million by 1900. New York grew from 60,000 to 3.4 million in the same period. That growth required massive amounts of construction, infrastructure development and resource extraction. We have detailed records of that growth, census data, tax records, trade statistics, shipping manifests, employment figures. We know how many bricks were made, how much lumber was cut, how much coal was mined. We can track the flow of materials into cities and the flow of goods out. None of that data shows disruption consistent with a catastrophe that buried cities. Instead, the data shows steady expansion with occasional contractions during economic panics or wars. The Panic of 1873, for example, caused a depression that lasted several years. Banks failed, construction slowed, unemployment rose. We can see all of that in the economic records. It wasn't caused by a mud flood. It was caused by over-speculation in railroad investments and the collapse of Jay Cook's banking empire. If a catastrophe had buried cities, the economic shock would have been orders of magnitude larger. Trade would have collapsed. Labour markets would have seized up, government revenues would have plummeted, the financial records would show massive disruption. They don't. They show the normal ups and downs of 19th century economic development. Some proponents suggest the mud flood targeted specific buildings, particularly older ornate structures. The idea is these buildings survived from a previous civilization, but Victorian architecture was ornate by design. It valued decoration, craftsmanship, and visible displays of wealth. Buildings from that era feature detailed stonework and elaborate facades because that's what people wanted. We can trace architectural styles through the 1800s, Greek Revival in the early decades, Gothic Revival in the mid-century, Romanesque Revival, Queen Anne, Beaux-Arts. Each style has documented origins and example buildings we can date precisely through construction records. Now, let's address the claim that historical records were altered or suppressed. To suppress evidence of a global catastrophe, you'd need cooperation across nations that were often at war with each other. The 1800s saw the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the American Civil War, the Franco-Prussian War. Nations that couldn't agree on borders would somehow need to agree on a comprehensive cover-up. You'd need to control government archives, private collections, newspapers, scientific societies, and personal correspondence. You'd need to reach across language barriers and political systems. You'd need to alter photographs and forge documents in dozens of languages before the information age, when communication was slow. The logistics make it implausible. More importantly, you'd need a motive. Why would governments suppress evidence of a natural disaster? Natural disasters create opportunities for governments to demonstrate competence through relief and rebuilding. There's no reason why every government would want to hide a catastrophe that wasn't their fault. The conspiracy explanation also requires millions of ordinary people to forget a life-changing event. People who lived through it, who lost homes and loved ones, who would tell their children. Collective amnesia on that scale doesn't happen. Memories persist. Oral histories get passed down. We have family histories from the 1800s. Diaries, letters, photographs, heirlooms preserving stories of immigration, wars, personal tragedies. If a mud flood had buried cities, those histories would reference it. They don't. They contain normal 19th century experiences with no mention of a civilization-ending catastrophe. Let's look at one more angle. The technological argument. Some mud flood proponents claim buildings show evidence of more advanced construction techniques than the 1800s possessed. They point to large stone blocks, sophisticated plumbing or electrical systems. But the 1800s were incredibly innovative. Steam power, telegraphs, photography, concrete, steel beams, elevators. Engineers built massive bridges, dug long tunnels, constructed buildings that still stand today. The Brooklyn Bridge, completed in 1883, used steel cables and pneumatic caissons. The Eiffel Tower, finished in 1889, was an engineering marvel. The Crystal Palace in London, built for the 1851 Great Exhibition, used prefabricated cast iron and glass on a scale never seen before. When you see sophisticated construction from the 1800s, you're seeing evidence that 19th century engineers knew what they were doing. They had physics, mathematics, material science, and practical experience. They documented how they did it. The pattern recognition that drives mud flood belief is actually a cognitive bias. Humans are really good at seeing patterns even when they're not there. When you look at dozens of photos of construction sites and start with the assumption that they're all related, your brain starts connecting them into a narrative. But correlation isn't causation, and similarity isn't evidence of a shared origin. Those photos show construction projects spanning decades in different cities for different purposes. Some are sewer installations, some are street work, some are building foundations, some are subway excavations. They're similar because excavation looks like excavation, not because they're all uncovering the same buried civilization. The mud flood theory fails at every level of analysis. Geologically, there's no source for the mud and no mechanism for transport. Physically, the deposits would look different, and the buildings wouldn't survive intact. Historically, there are no contemporary accounts, and the documented record explains everything. Economically, there's no disruption in the data. Technologically, 19th century engineering was capable of everything we see. What remains after all, that is not a mystery but a misunderstanding of how cities develop, how geology works, and how historical evidence should be evaluated. The mud flood theory isn't an alternative history, It's a misreading of actual history, built on fragments taken out of context and assembled into a narrative that can't withstand scrutiny. Cities change. That's what they do. They grow, adapt, rebuild, and evolve. The traces of that evolution are visible everywhere if you know what you're looking for. Raised streets, modified buildings, layered infrastructure. All of it documented, all of it explainable, all of it normal. The real history is there, the records exist, the explanations are clear. The mud flood didn't happen because it couldn't have happened, and the evidence reflects that reality. What we're left with is the actual history of urban development, which is fascinating and complex and doesn't require any catastrophes to be interesting. So where did all the mud come from? It didn't, because there was no mud flood. Just cities doing what cities have always done, changing over time.